So today I want us to talk about Irish history and particularly the struggle for Irish independence. Whenever you talk about Irish history, it is more than anything else the discussion of a very difficult, even tragic relationship between Ireland and England. And it's been tragic for both sides. We'll get into that, but the issue related to England is that England got involved in Ireland in the 12th century. By the 17th century, they had conquered Ireland, and it wasn't until the 20th century that Ireland ended up getting its independence from England and became a republic. At least most of it did. One of the things I'll get to toward the end is to talk about the troubles, as they call them, in Northern Ireland between Catholics and Protestants, and why that's really much more a political issue than it is a religious issue. I will warn you, there's so much content to this history thing. Today will be longer than usual as a talk. It'll only be about 4 hours. Just kidding. Usually my talks are less than 45 minutes and there's time for questions and everything. There'll still be time for questions, but this one goes a little bit longer than that. We may go close to an hour on this one today. I'll just warn you. But as I always say to my congregation, if you need to take a nap, then feel free to do so. If I can help, I'm happy to help in any way I can, all right? Or if you need to leave for any reason. So I'm going to give you a real quick sort of background history of the history of Ireland, and then we'll get into the modern times and the relationship between Ireland and England and Irish independence. We know for a fact that in Ireland, there have been people here since the Stone Age, what we call the Aboriginal people of Ireland, just like there are Aborigines in Australia. Everywhere that there were ancient, that is Stone Age people, we refer to the first people as the Aborigines or Aboriginal people. There are a lot of monuments in Ireland that go back to the Stone Age. Many of them we don't know a whole lot about, we just know they're there and that they represent human habitation. We have examples like this. This is Potato Famine in the western part of Ireland. It's a tomb called a dolmen. And to give you some idea, this is probably Mesolithic from the middle Stone Age. These pillars that support the table are over 6 feet tall. The table is over 12 feet long. We have no idea how they did that, okay? But we have a number of dolmens like this that were burial sites, and they excavated the people buried underneath them. Over here, these 3 pictures on the right is a location not too far from Dublin that's called Newgrange. It too is from the Stone Age, probably the 4th millennium BC, and it's a tomb. The opening, the door here, goes back through a chamber, a long hallway, and there are small chambers on each side, and then a central burial chamber. And this is over 1 acre in size. It's huge. And it's designed so that on the 22nd of December, which is the morning after the longest night of the year, there's an opening above the doorway that's about the size of a shoebox. The light of the sunrise on the morning after the longest night of the year will shine directly through that opening and illuminate the entire hallway and central burial area. So it's very carefully designed to recognize the rising of the sun after the longest night and the fact that the sun is returning. Another area here, this is called the Hill of Tara, which is again not too far from Newgrange, not too far from Dublin, and it was apparently the site of the ancient High King of Ireland. Now the High King of Ireland didn't rule all of Ireland, he was like the first among equals, but apparently it was used for rituals of various kinds. You'll notice the ring around here. This is typical, they didn't have stone forts back then. It's Newgrange is kind of unusual that it was built with stone in that way, but they would have had a palisade, ditches, etc. In fact, you've heard of a henge, like Stonehenge. I'm going to talk about Druid standing stones and ancient pagans later. Well, a henge is stone in terms of standing stones, but it also involves earthwork, ditches and mounds and things like that. So this would have been technically a henge. On this side here, there's the Lead File, which is the Stone of Destiny. It's prehistoric, Stone Age. The story is that when the true King of Ireland returns and touches the Stone of Destiny, it will cry out in recognition that he is the true king. All right, so we have all of these monuments, many of which have had stories from ancient times passed down about them. The next part of Irish history, and obviously I'm not doing this a lot of detail justice, or we would be here for 4 hours or 4 days. We have the Celtic people, and you're familiar with the Celtic people, but who were they? Where did they come from? The map here gives you an idea where the Celts originally came from. The dark pink area, which is sort of the Rhineland area in Central Europe, by that I mean the central part of Western Europe, was the primary location for them, but they had spread out all the way over into the Ukraine, down into the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, throughout Western Europe. Gaul is the ancient name for what we call France, in the area around France. But what happened is in the 5th century, the 400s, leading up to that, from like the 1st century to the 5th century, the barbarians began to move into Europe, the Roman Empire expanded, and more and more and more, the Celts were pushed further west and further west and further west until they ended up in the British Isles. Particularly, this map over here will tell you that Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Brittany, which is this part of the very western part of France, and then also the corner of Spain as well, Galicia, has a lot of Celtic influence. And the Isle of Man, where we are today, was a major Celtic center. So this Celtic people were pushed further and further, and you'll notice that there's a big area here, the area we know of as England, that there aren't Celts in. That's because the Anglo-Saxons came and pushed them back, and so we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But the Celts were known for their extraordinary artistry. They were great metal workers. You all know about Celtic knots, right? The jewelry, women probably have earrings that have Celtic knots in them. They're very popular. They did a lot of metal work. They made tools, they made weapons. They were really excellent at agriculture. They built roads. In fact, the Roman roads in Britain, many of the Roman roads were simply put down over top of where the Celts had roads. They just put flagstones over them. So they also were quite vicious in battle. And all of this sort of design work that you see here is representative of the kind of detailed artistry that the Celts brought to all of their work. So they were very significant as a culture. They had a very complex polytheism originally. The priestly class of the Celts were called the Druids, and I'm going to talk about that in my last talk on the cruise, Druids, Standing Stones, and Ancient Pagans. But they had over 400 named gods. It was a very complex polytheism. The most powerful of their gods was called Dagda. Dagda the Powerful. He was considered creator and preserver and destroyer. But the favorite god was a female god, the goddess, who was called Danu, and her children, the Tuatha De Danann, and again, I'm going to talk about those a little later, they became the great heroes and the minor gods and even the spiritual beings in Ireland. You know, Ireland is famous for leprechauns and fairies and trolls and elves and all kinds of things. All of those are considered descendants of the Tuatha De Danann, the descendants of Danu, the goddess. And so all of that mythology is tied together. And even later, when the Romans came in the 1st century AD, they converted the Celts to Christianity, at least the Celts in what we know of as England and Wales here. And when they converted them to Christianity, however, they tended to maintain a lot of those beliefs in other beings. And that happened too with the Christianity in Ireland. I read a thing recently, an Irish man said, yes, I believe in the Father and in the Son and in the Holy Spirit and in the she who rides on the winds, the banshee, you know, one of the beliefs of the spiritual beings in the Irish mythology. Well, for the Celts in Ireland, the major change came when Christianity came to Ireland, and it came in the form of one person, and that was St. Patrick, or Patricius as he was known. In the early 400s, slavery was the most profitable industry back in this day. The Vikings were involved in it later, the Celts were involved in it. A group of small boats came across from Ireland to England in the early 400s, and this is right about the time the Roman armies left to go back to Rome. They were recalled, and they captured about 1,000 young people and took them back to Ireland as slaves. One of them was a Roman, a Latinized Anglo-Saxon, or a Latinized Celtic, by the name of Patricius. He was 16 years old. They took him back to Ireland. He was a slave there for 6 years. He worked up in the mountains taking care of sheep. He was a shepherd slave. For 6 years, he had little to eat. He suffered the cold. And because he had come from Christianized Celtic people in England, he was a Christian. And over the 6 years of being almost entirely alone, he developed a very powerful spirituality. He had a constant sense of God's presence and a very rich prayer life. After 6 years, he heard God speak to him and say, your hungers are to be met. Your boat has arrived. Go home. He walked over 200 miles to the coast. He found a boat. He went first to Gaul, first to the continent. Later, after several years, made his way back to his home and was back in amongst his family members and everything. And then a short time after that, God spoke to him again and said, I want you to go back to Ireland, the place where you were a slave, and I want you to take a Christian message to them. And so he first went back to Gaul and studied at a monastery. He became a priest and then a bishop, and then he became the first evangelizing bishop ever in the history of the church. He went back to Ireland, and over the next 30 years, he traveled virtually every inch of Ireland. He personally was responsible for fundamentally changing the Irish people. They had been a very violent tribal people. They were always quick to have revenge grudges. Murder was common. Slavery was a way of life. He's the first person, Patrick is the first person in history that we know of that ever talked about slavery as being immoral. And he convinced the Irish not only to convert to Christianity, but to not have slavery anymore, to not fight wars. The whole culture was changed by this one man in this one generation. Of course, he's well known for the shamrock, which we almost always see in his hands, because apparently the shamrock, common in Ireland, that's how he explained the Trinity. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. It's one thing, but it's got 3 parts. And in the same way, they think the Celtic peoples really understood this because their religion tended to be in 3 parts. They tended to think of earth, sky, and sea as the 3 elements of nature, that human beings all had a body, a soul, and a spirit. So when he talked about God being in 3 parts, they said, well, that makes sense. And in fact, Steve talked about the very unusual symbol of the Isle of Man, the 3 armored legs. That triskelion, or 3-part, is very common in ancient Celtic culture, and Isle of Man is a Celtic center. So I think that, we don't know exactly how we got to that, but we think that has something to do with it. We also, you'll notice here, the story is that Patrick drove all those snakes out of Ireland. Well, it's more likely that all the snakes left Ireland during the last ice age, but he gets credit for it, and that's fine, because there are no snakes in Ireland, right? Well, he not only converted the island of Ireland to Christianity, but he did so with no martyrs. There was virtually no bloodshed associated with this. And in doing so, he planted churches and monasteries throughout Ireland. When I do the next talk, how the Irish saved civilization, I'm going to get into more detail about that, but he is the one responsible. If you go to Ireland now and you see the high crosses, this one is actually, this particular one is from Iona. It's not actually in Ireland, but they have a lot of them like that. That was just a great image of one, and so I thought I'd use it. But you have churches and cathedrals all over. And the thing I'm going to talk about next in 2 nights is the Irish were never invaded by the barbarians of Western Europe, in the same way the Romans never got to Ireland. While the barbarians, starting in the 5th century for the next several hundred years, were devastating Western Europe, burning libraries, forcing people to live not in towns anymore, the Irish monks were copying books, and they returned civilization to Western Europe after the barbarians had been Christianized. We'll talk about that in 2 nights. Then in the 8th century, starting in the 790s, with Island of Lindisfarne, we'll get into this in Vikings. See, I'm giving you just a taste here because this relates to Ireland, but we'll get into more detail later. The Vikings, in their longships, first attacked Lindisfarne, which is just south of the border between England and Scotland. It's an island. And then, very shortly after that, they came over to Ireland, and the monks were astonished by this. The ruthlessness of the Vikings, the fact they had no respect for the sacred, they didn't fear God, They were pretty brutal. Well, when they came over to Ireland, the Danes started coming into England, and then the Norwegian Vikings started coming over to Ireland. They tried to conquer Ireland. But in England, there were kings. There were at the time they came, there were really only 4 major kings. You defeat a king and you had control of that whole area. Well, Ireland had many different kings and chieftains and lords. It was not easy. Plus, they're the Irish, and they were a very tough group back then. So all the Vikings were really able to do were to plant settlements that they could use as trading villages. Particularly, if you look at Ireland, the coastal cities of Limerick, of Cork, of Waterford, of Wexford, and Dublin, all were planted by Vikings. All of those were originally Viking cities. If you ever have a chance to go to Waterford, they have some great museums there about the Viking history. They even have the original, what they call the Viking Triangle, which is where the Viking city was when they first planted that. And the Vikings tried to conquer more of Ireland, didn't have any luck, but you're going to have to come back to the talk on Vikings to find out about that, okay? Why did the Vikings attack? Why did they especially, want to conquer Ireland? Well, this is why. Because the arts of the Celts, the Celtic artistry, once they became Christianized, they applied it to their Christian faith. And so Ireland was full of monasteries and churches. They were all soft targets, to use a modern expression. They didn't have weapons, they didn't have military forces, the monasteries couldn't defend themselves, but they were full of chalices and of all kinds of other valuable pieces of gold and silver. They had crosses and crucifixes, altar pieces, illuminated manuscripts. If you had a chance to see the Book of Kells, that's one example. And these manuscripts frequently would have gilded covers with precious stones embedded in them. These were all acts of committing whatever wealth people had to God. It was a way of trying to honor God for the spiritual blessings they'd received. This is called the Cup of Armagh, or the Chalice of Armagh. It's silver, and you can't really tell from this picture, but all of this area in here is not just gold, it's this beautiful fine filigree of gold. This is called the Pin of Tara, very famous. It's embedded with gems and made from gold, and so this is why the Vikings were interested in taking on the monasteries. It was an easy fight, there was no problem with it, and this is the kind of stuff they could take. Some of the monasteries they attacked multiple times in a year because they would come back and the monks would have dug up some of the treasures they had buried before they got there, or they would have brought more in. So this continued for some time. Now, we get to England and the relationship between England and Ireland. The story starts really in the 1100s, in the 12th century. In the mid-1100s, the king of Leinster, which was one of the small kingdoms in Ireland, ran off with the wife of the king of Breffni. And nobody liked it, other than probably the king of, MacMurrough, the king of Leinster. All the other local kings, and a king in that day wasn't the kind of king we think about. They were mostly chieftains. And there was a high king, but the high king was sort of the first among equals. It's not like everybody owed him obedience. Well, all the other kings in Ireland, including the high king, turned against MacMurrough, the king of Leinster, because he'd run off with the wife of another king, and they defeat him. Rory O'Connor was the high king. They defeat MacMurrough. Nobody in the whole of Ireland was on his side anymore. So what he does is he turns to his next door neighbor, which I don't have here, but you know what's over here? England. So he turns to England. At that time, Henry II was the king of England. Well, Henry II had acquired more property probably than any king before him because of the Edward III, because of the Duke of Normandy coming across in 1066, the Norman conquest. Henry II owned property in France. He was in control of Wales. He was in control of Scotland. And here, the king of Leinster, MacMurrough, comes and says, "Would you come and help me?" And Henry said, "Oh, maybe this is an opportunity to get Ireland too." Well, he happened to be busy at the time. He was overworked dealing with some problems in France, so he sent one of his earls. The earl's name was Robert de Clare. Robert de Clare was a great warrior. And these are Norman knights. These are French knights. They would have spoken French at this point. Well, Richard de Clare had a nickname. He was called Strongbow. Have you seen Strongbow cider? Okay, in your travels? Strongbow cider is named after Richard de Clare, the Earl that came over from England to Ireland in the 1170s. He, at the request of McMurrough, they defeated the other kings and finally got a surrender from the High King, along with all the others. And in thanks for that, the King of Leinster, McMurrough, made Strongbow, the Earl, the regent of Leinster, gave his daughter to marry Richard de Clare, and said, when I die, you can become king. Well, Henry II, the King of England, is over in France, and he gets word that one of his earls has just been made a king in Ireland, and he sees a problem here. So Henry comes over to Ireland, and he gets all of the kings, including Richard de Clare, to swear fealty to him, and they conquer all of Ireland in the name of the king. Now, what happened was all of this territory down here in blue and then up here was taken over by English lords. It was now the property of Englishmen. This area here, the red area, was known as the Pale. It was the area around Dublin. Well, a short time, 150 years later, after a lot of time, see, these lords were living over here, these English lords, well, they were going native. They were becoming, as they say, more Irish than the Irish. And the English nobility were getting nervous about this because they thought, we're getting a competitive kingdom over here. So they passed in 1366 what are called the Statutes of Kilkenny. Those statutes said, and here's where you begin to get some of the real problem between England and Ireland. The Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366 outlawed marriage between anybody English and Irish. And that always meant English men and Irish women. They made it a crime to speak the Irish language, the Gaelic. By the way, in Ireland, it's called Gaelic. In Scotland, it's called Gaelic. Okay, so, and they're not exactly the same, but they're the same basis. So they also rejected all of the Brehon law, it was called, which was the law of Ireland, in favor of English common law. So they're saying you don't get your own laws anymore. And they outlawed the Irish oral culture. Ireland had always been this hugely, their folklore, their culture was a huge thing to them. In fact, they had these storytellers and bards who would travel around and sing songs in return for a place to stay and some food. They were called a shonachie. That was how news was carried out. That's how the old stories were told. All of that was outlawed. But the problem was, these were the Irish. And as we'll talk about when we talk about Vikings, they were not easy to put down. And so the area here, which was controlled by the King of England specifically, was called the Pale. Have you ever heard the expression, beyond the Pale? This was the only area they were ever really successful in enforcing the Statutes of Kilkenny. Outside, the people continued to do mostly whatever they thought they wanted to, because that was beyond the pale. All right, that's where you get that expression. But this is the first example where the English start really laying oppressive laws on them. They not only conquered them, but they start treating them differently than English citizens. Then we come to this guy. You recognize him? Henry VIII, all right? In 1534, Henry, well, over a period of several years, Henry VIII breaks the relationship between the church in England with the Pope and the Catholic Church and forms the Anglican Church. And so he now not only is the monarch of England, he is also the head of the new Anglican Protestant Church, right? He's the head of the church, he's the head of the state. Well, there's a problem. He's also the head of state, the monarch over the Irish, who are very Catholic. The idea of the Irish giving up their Catholicism, giving up their relationship to Rome and the Pope, because the King of England, who's their king officially now as well, told them to, they weren't willing to do that. And there were a lot of rebellions at this point. Those sorts of things continued, and as you know, Henry VIII had 3 children. Edward, his son, the youngest of the 3, was sickly, didn't live long, but he was a Protestant. Then his oldest child, Mary, became the queen, and she was Catholic. She tried to stop the Protestant church in England. She became known as Bloody Mary because of her persecution of Protestants. And then the third of the children was Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth was a sharp cookie, because what she did in order to stop this warfare between Catholics and Protestants was she had the Anglican Church look like it was Catholic, but be based on Protestant theology. This is why the Anglican Church today, or the Episcopal Church in the United States, has bishops and priests. They have a high form of liturgy and all of that, because it looks Catholic, but it's based upon, actually Calvinist, Protestant theology, the Westminster Confessions. So she was very sharp. That doesn't mean it ended the conflict. But one of the things, again, is after quite a bit of time of struggle, she and the Parliament during her time and other nobles said, we got to crack down on these Catholic Irish because they keep rebelling and rising up. And so there was one major rebellion in about 3,500 Catholic Spanish, because France and Spain were Catholic. And they kept trying to find a way to support the Catholics in Great Britain. It wasn't actually called Great Britain then, but you get the idea. And so they landed troops in Ireland. In 1607, there was a major battle, the Battle of Kinsale. And one of the reasons they were moved to do that is because Queen Elizabeth had new laws passed, called the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, that formally made the Church of Ireland a Protestant church. They're all Catholics, but it made it a Protestant church. It also said that everybody who was in Ireland, as well as everywhere else that was controlled by the Queen of England, they had to swear obedience to Elizabeth, not only as the monarch, but also as the head of the church, which meant the Pope's not the head of the church anymore. And the Catholics were not going for that. So we have all of these uprisings. And again, in 1607, the Spanish landed 3,500 troops. The Catholics, some of the earls in Ireland, get together to fight against the English because of this. And particularly two of the earls, the Earl O'Donnell and O'Neill, and they're up here. I mean, if you can see this, it's O'Donnell and O'Neill. They're in the north. They get together with these Spanish guys and they fight for freedom, to be able to practice their Catholic faith. They lose at the Battle of Kinsale in 1607. And as a result of that, these two of the most powerful and important earls in all of Ireland, they flee Ireland and go to the continent. This is called the Flight of the Earls. And they actually have stamps in Ireland about them now. This blue area up here was all the area that they controlled. Well, when the earls left, the Crown of England claimed it for their own, and they invited Protestants to come and settle there, both Protestants from England and Scottish Presbyterians. And so, Scotland is right here. You can see it actually right there if you're, on the land, assuming it's not a day like today. So all these Scottish Presbyterians come in, these Protestants from England come over, and they take over all this land. You begin to see why there are Protestants in the north, because the land was confiscated from Catholics and given to Protestants. Then, as if that weren't bad enough, we come to the next major period in English history, which is the period of the late 1640s and 1650s, the time of the English Civil War and the Commonwealth. This is the time when in England, the Parliament got tired of the king telling them what to do, and some of this had to do with religious differences too. So they declared in 1649 that England was now a commonwealth and not a monarchy. They arrested Charles I and they cut off his head and declared that they were not a monarchy anymore. Well, at that time, the head of the army that was doing all this was Oliver Cromwell. This is him. Cromwell, then, as part of this whole process, there were uprisings. The Irish thought, hey, this is an opportunity for us to rise up. And, England is in bad shape right now. They just cut off the head of their king. So the Irish are rebelling, and Oliver Cromwell takes the new army over there and devastates Ireland. It's estimated that there were several 100,000 people either killed or sent off into servitude, which means slavery, basically, by Oliver Cromwell. There were instances where he massacred whole villages. In one case, when one of the first villages, Drunock, who tried to fight back, he killed everybody. Another case, a village at first was going to repel him, and then they said, no, wait, we'll surrender. Well, his soldiers had gotten such a head up that they ended up killing all the people anyway. To this day, Oliver Cromwell is perhaps the most hated person in history to the Irish. Well, you see this map. This sort of green area, khaki green area here, is the only area in Ireland at that point that was still allowed to be owned by Catholics. The rest of this was either given to government, like earls and others from England, or the dark blue areas were given to soldiers in the new army. Cromwell confiscated the Catholic lands and gave it to his army, the Protestants, because he was a Puritan. And so he didn't like Catholics anyway. So you end up, especially in the north. Now, that doesn't mean there were no Catholics down here. It means they just weren't allowed to own property. In fact, the next event we come to involves, this is James II. I have to tell you, they arrested Charles I, cut off his head. In 1658, after 5 years as the Lord Protector of England, Cromwell dies. His son is not up to the job of taking over. Nobody's up to taking over. And they say, we need the king back. So they go over to France to the son of Charles I, who they killed, Charles II, and they go, okay, I know we cut your dad's head off, but we want you to come back. And he did. Charles II comes back, and he becomes the King of England. Now, he is a Protestant, technically. He actually converts to Roman Catholicism on his deathbed, but he's in office for 27 years in office. He's the king for 27 years. When he dies, they get his brother, James, to become king. James is an affirmed Catholic. And they don't really like that, but he's the only one still in that family that's available to them, they think. So he becomes the king, and he keeps trying to advocate religious toleration for Catholics. For instance, he appoints the first ever Catholic viceroy to Ireland, since it's a Catholic place. And so they don't like it, and all of the nobles are really having trouble with him. And then finally, the last straw for them was he has a son who's also named James. And they say, this is the start of a Catholic dynasty. We got to do something. So they go over to the continent. James's sister, Mary, was a Protestant. She was married to William of Orange. We call it the Netherlands. It was that area in the Low Country. William of Orange was a hero among Protestants. He had been fighting the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor over all kinds of stuff. So they invite these two to come over. You've heard of William and Mary. There's a William and Mary College. They came over to be monarchs, and they threw James out. He goes over to Ireland. And in Ireland, the Catholics in Ireland want to support him as a Catholic king. And so they put an army together, and they end up fighting a couple of battles. But because William brings an army over to Ireland, and the really decisive battle is in 1690, the Battle of the Boyne, in which the Williamite Protestant armies from England completely destroy the Catholic army. As a result of that, James ends up fleeing back to France, where his father had been. Well, this is the start of the Jacobite rebellions. Bonnie Prince Charlie was the grandson of this James. And so we're going to talk about that when we talk about Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Jacobite rebellion, and the Battle of Culloden. There was an effort that went on for 70 years, 65 years, to try to put the descendants of James II back on the throne. It started in Ireland, and then it went to Scotland. One of the things that happened after the Battle of the Boyne, after the Catholic Irish are defeated, they're given an option. The soldiers of that army are told you can either swear obedience to William and Mary as the new monarchs of England, or you can leave Ireland and go somewhere else in Europe and be in the army of somebody else, because there were Irish brigades in most militaries at that time. So 14,000 Irish soldiers leave and go somewhere else in Europe. What's happened is you now have the most powerful of the earls have fled Ireland, and 14,000 of their armed soldiers from the Irish armed soldiers have left, Ireland has virtually no opportunity now to really defend itself, at least for a long time. And at this point, William and Mary pass what are called the Penal Laws in order to try to really clamp down on the Irish. First, the oath of supremacy is expanded so that all Catholics are prevented from serving in any government office. So they cannot be involved in ruling their own land. The Banishment Act, the same year in 91, drives almost all of the priests and bishops out of Ireland. Catholics could not enter certain professions like law and medicine, the premier professions. They couldn't be officers in the military. They could not be policemen. They could not own weapons. They could not own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. And there's one of the great songs and poems of this time is called The Lament for Art O'Leary. Art O'Leary had been an Irishman that served in the Hungarian Hussars Regiment, a cavalry regiment for the Austro-Hungarians. And he was so brilliant that the Empress of Austria gave him this really valuable stallion as a gift when he left and came back to Ireland. And he brought the horse back with him. Well, the local sheriff, who was a Protestant, comes up to Art O'Leary and says, I want that horse. Here's 5 pounds for it. And this horse was worth a fortune. And Art O'Leary said, no, I'm not selling you this horse. Well, legally, he was not allowed to own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. A few days later, he was found dead. And the sheriff ended up getting a horse. So this is the kind of thing that they were struggling with back then. All Catholic education was outlawed. Catholics had to pay a tithe to the Protestant Church of Ireland. So Catholics had to give 10% of their income to a church that they would never go to because it was Protestant. The Catholics were not allowed to inherit their father's land. If your parents died, somebody else got the land. And so the Catholics ended up all paying rent for land that used to belong to them. And they were limited in what they could grow or how they could make a living because there were very strict anti-competition laws that gave an advantage to the English, which is one of the reasons why the Potato Famine happens later, because there was very little that they were allowed to grow. So all of this led to what's called the Anglo-Protestant ascendancy. The ascendancy was a period of time in which every social position, every political position, every position of any kind of influence in Ireland, Catholic Ireland, was held by Protestants. Most of the landowners were absentee landlords. They lived in England, but they owned the land that the Irish had to pay rent for. You get the picture? This is how it really were political issues. They were issues of political oppression, but they got labeled, they got turned into a difference between Catholic and Protestant. It had less to do with differences in worship than it did with who's in charge here, okay? We then come to a time, the Age of Revolution in the 1700s. Of course, that's when we had the American Revolution. That's when the French Revolution happens. After the American Revolution, the English were really determined they were not going to lose any more colonies because colonies were worth a lot of money. They brought in a lot of income. Well, at first, England started really, really clamping down on the Irish, and then they said, wait a minute, maybe that's the wrong approach. Maybe we need to be easier, you know. So they became a little more tactful. Because of that increased freedom, this is a man named Wolfe Tone. Wolfe Tone, the coolest name ever. Wolfe Tone started an organization called the Society of United Irishmen. This is their flag and their symbol over here. And at first he was in favor of political reform. He wanted to get the laws changed so that they had freedom in Catholic Ireland. Well, after a while that wasn't working. And so he and others began to pursue more aggressive approaches. He actually was responsible for starting several invasions by French. By the way, the only time the French Navy has ever succeeded in invading England was William the Conqueror. Every other time they tried to do it, a storm comes up and blows them off course or something happens. Trafalgar, the Battle of Slides, and on and on and on. Well, in this case, the French Catholics were coming over to help the Irish. When Wolfe Tone was there, their boats get blown off course, they don't show up. Well, after several attempted rebellions, Wolfe Tone is finally arrested. This is one of the battles, the Battle of Vinegar Hill. You'll notice they're flying the flag of the Society of United Irishmen, fighting against the British. Well, the rebellions are all put down. Wolfe Tone is arrested. He is sentenced to die, but before he's executed, he mysteriously dies in police custody. And so all of that stops in the 1700s. We come to the 1800s. In 1801, out of fear for all of these Catholic rebellions in Ireland, the Prime Minister of England, William Pitt, proposes and gets passed the Act of Union, which combines the Irish Parliament with the English Parliament. Previously, Ireland had their own parliament, but any rules they passed, any laws they made had to be approved by London. Now, William Pitt gets the Act of Union passed, and that means that the Irish no longer even have their own parliament. They have a certain number of positions that are allowed in the British Parliament, but they can only be Protestants, no Catholics. So it had to be Protestant ministers of Parliament. In 1775, this man is born. His name is Daniel O'Connell. He became known as the Great Liberator. Daniel O'Connell in Ireland is the equivalent of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in the US or of Mahatma Gandhi in India. He organized a new organization called the Catholic Association. And in order to raise money for it, you can't see here, but it says Catholic rent right there. He asked every Catholic in Ireland to give 1 penny a month. Well, there were 8 million people. So very soon, at 1 penny a month from every Irish Catholic, he ended up with a lot of money. He organized, Daniel O'Connell was in favor of Catholic emancipation, which means we need to be able to represent ourselves and vote for our causes. He was against slavery. He was in favor of women's rights and suffrage. He was in favor of religious toleration, but he was against armed violence. Well, he runs for parliament. Even though as a Catholic, he can't take his seat in parliament, and he's elected by a landslide. Well, in London, they're afraid that Daniel O'Connell is so popular, if we don't let him take his seat in parliament, we could have a rebellion. And even though he's not against violence, we don't know if he can control all these 8 million people that are supporting him. So they changed the law and allow Catholics to sit in parliament. And in that case, they felt like they had achieved emancipation in terms of now they have Catholics at least in parliament, they can vote on issues for them. He continues to work for the freedom of the people, and had fascinating techniques. He had what he called monster meetings, and they would have over 100,000 people getting together in Irish cities to deal with the concerns they had. But one of the last issues before he died that he tried to get the English Parliament to do something about is the greatest tragedy the Irish suffered, and that is the Irish Potato Famine. I told you before that the Irish, they were limited in what they could grow or what they could trade in because of the non-competition laws. Well, potatoes was something they could grow, and in fact, potatoes had become the primary foodstuff that the Irish lived on themselves and that they were able to sell. In 1845, a fungus attacked the potatoes in Ireland, and all of the potatoes were turned into this green mush that was inedible. Well, the first year, things happen in agriculture. The first year, they ate their seed potatoes, the ones that they had saved back to plant a new crop. They sold everything that they could sell or hawked it in order to try to get by, and they thought, okay, next year we'll do all right. Well, the potato famine continued because the same fungus came in 46, in 47, 48. So over the next 5 years, the most conservative estimates are that over 1 million Irish starved to death because of the potato famine. In addition, those that could, over 1 million more, I guess these are conservative. Some people say a lot more than this. At least 1 million more fled the country. They scraped together some way to get passage on a ship. And this was a common scene back then, the waving goodbye to people. And many of these people traveled to the New World, to America or Australia, aboard what were called coffin ships. These are ships that were not designed to carry passengers, and they would overcrowd them because they fully expected a lot of these people were going to die en route. And because they were weakened, because of starvation, cholera and other diseases were rampant. People were dying from disease as well as starvation. And if that wasn't bad enough, the various English landlords, since the Irish small farmers had to pay rent and they couldn't pay rent, they started throwing them off their land. So it was a time of massive eviction. So the Irish not only had nothing to eat, they had no place to go, no place to live. And in the period of the famine between 1845 and 1848, there went from 300,000 small farms to 88,000 farms, because people were evicted and all of the property, the property owner said, we'll put these together in bigger lots and we'll make more money. The English government refused to do hardly anything about it. A couple of prime ministers or a couple of ministers of parliament tried to do some feeding programs, but the bottom line is, as this represents, the Irish came to hate the British more than ever because they felt like they didn't do anything when they were starving. This is a poster, a mural that says Britain's genocide by starvation, Ireland's Holocaust, 1845 to 1849, over 1.5 million deaths. As I told you, the million plus that I said is considered very conservative. And again, one more reason for the Irish to hate the English. In 1913, the first of four major events happens politically. And I'm going to go through these pretty quickly because, you know, I've gone for more than 45 minutes now. It's called the Dublin lockout. At that time, the slums in Dublin were the worst probably in the world, certainly in Europe. People were starving to death in their homes. They had no sanitation, they had no running water, they had nothing. Well, and they didn't have any unions. So the workers were victimized by the employers all over the place. In England, they had labor unions. So a man named James Larkin comes over to Dublin and he starts a labor union. It's called the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, in order to try to help the people. One of the most powerful men in Dublin at that time was a man named William Martin Murphy. He owned the United Tramway Company, as represented down here. He told all of his employees, a large employer, all of his employees, they would not be allowed to join the union. Well, in response to that, James Larkin calls for a strike, and he calls for other industries to go on strike in order to support that. So on August 26 of 1913, they go on strike, but unfortunately, Murphy, the owner of the tramway service, he had gotten the police and thugs, strikebreakers all ready. When it happens, they start attacking the Irish workers. The police would, you can see here, hundreds injured in baton charges. The police were attacking with batons. In one instance, two people, unarmed crowd, was killed while they were listening to Larkin speak for them. And unfortunately, and they even put together what was called the Irish Defense, the Irish Citizens Army, to defend the workers against this, the brutality that was going on. And the police were on the side of the owners. Eventually, they had to give up on this strike because the people were too poor to be able to hold out. They didn't have the sort of things that are available today, like they have strike funds that can feed families while you do this. So the workers lost this, but again, there's this seething kind of hatred that continues to go on about their plight. In 1914, the Civil War starts, the First World War starts. And in the First World War, despite the conflict that was occurring between England and Ireland, the Irish sent 150,000 soldiers to fight for the army of England at that point. Now, just a month after the war is declared, August of 1914, the war is declared. In September of 1914, the Parliament in London passes a Home Rule law that says that Ireland will be able to rule themselves. But they convinced the leaders in Ireland not that, okay, we need to postpone the implementation of this because we got a war on our hands. And they agree to do it. The Irish send 150,000 soldiers, 50,000 of them don't come home. So a third of the Irish soldiers that went to war didn't come home. 1916, of course, the war's still going on. One of the reasons they said we'll postpone this is because everybody thought the First World War was going to take maybe 6 months. It starts in August. Everybody was saying by Christmas it'll all be done. Obviously, that didn't happen. The most horrendous war in human history. Not the most deaths, Second World War is that, but just devastating to all of Europe. Well, in 1916, the guys who were part of the freedom movement, the independence movement in Ireland, get tired of waiting. And they say maybe this is the right time to really rebel because the English are occupied with the war. So in 1916, they have what's called the 1916 Rising. They had planned on having people all over Ireland rise up at the same time. They were going to do it on Easter Sunday, but a shipment of weapons that they were expecting from Germany didn't come, so they postponed it. And then the guys in Dublin said, finally, look, we're not going to wait any longer. On Easter Monday, 1,500 of them occupy major government buildings. The government post office was called the GPO, if you look at a Dublin map, and other sites. Unfortunately, that was only 1/3 of the people they expected to come out in Dublin, and nowhere else in the country did anybody rise up. Well, because they only had 1,500 people, the military was sent in. General John Maxwell, an English general, comes in with the army, and they start retaking one building after the other because they didn't have enough troops to support the effort. Maxwell considers this a major crime. He declares martial law. He arrests 3,500 people, and he doesn't seem to care whether they're civilians or whether they were involved in the rebellion. And he ends up having 16 of the leaders summarily executed without trial over the next 12 days. These were the leaders, and some of them, Patrick Pearse, James Connolly, were major leaders in Ireland. James Connolly had been so badly wounded in the fighting, he couldn't stand up, so they strapped him to a chair in order to shoot him in a firing squad. Well, the problem is, the brutality that they showed was such that everybody around the world who heard about this felt sympathy for the Irish. The 1916 uprising was foolish. It wasn't well planned, they weren't ready for it, they didn't get the participation they thought, but instead of being a foolish act, it ended up being an act of martyrdom. And people all over the world, in fact, H.H. Asquith, who was the prime minister at that time, immediately went from London to Dublin to stop the executions, but by then it was too late. Everybody was feeling sympathy for the martyrdom of the Irish in the 1916 uprising. Then the Irish War of Independence. 2 years after the 1916 uprising, 1918, in Ireland, because they were allowed 105 seats in the Parliament in London, they formed a new political party called the Sinn Féin, which means we ourselves. And they said, if we get the majority of votes, we are going to take that as a mandate to declare ourselves an independent republic. They got 73 out of 105 seats. And two of the leaders then, Eamon de Valera, who became known as Dev, he became president later of the Republic of Ireland and led them in a lot of ways, and Michael Collins. De Valera was voted the president, Michael Collins was the Minister of Finance, and they started moving to just make themselves a republic. Well, England rather, started moving to prevent them from doing that. And so we have the War of Independence. From the Irish side, it was primarily a war of guerrilla warfare because the Irish didn't stand a chance standing up against the English army. And so it was mostly bombings and assassination, and they would take over a barracks of the Royal Irish Constabulary, which were the military, paramilitary force that the English had put in place. And so they fought, and during this time, De Valera goes to the US to raise money and support, and Michael Collins takes over. Well, finally, they get tired of all the battling, and Lloyd George, when De Valera comes back, Lloyd George says, let's call a truce, let's get together and iron this out. De Valera sends Michael Collins and a man named Arthur Griffith to London. They spend time, they work out an agreement, which Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith sign on behalf of the Irish. And when Michael Collins signs it, he said, I have signed my own death certificate. Because they agreed as a first step toward independence that they would still be part of the British Commonwealth as a free state, but not as a republic, not as an independent republic, which is what the Irish wanted. They also, the ministers of Parliament from Ireland would still have to declare their fealty to the monarch in England. And Northern Ireland, which was Protestant and had been separated, was not included in the agreement. Those three things were unacceptable to most of the people in Ireland. And yet, Michael Collins felt like this is the first step. We'll get the rest of this later. If we're a free state, if we're part of the Commonwealth, the way Canada is or whatever, we'll get complete Republican freedom later. Well, unfortunately, people did not agree with him. And after the War of Independence, and by the way, the British, again, were renowned for the brutality in this War of Independence, because the Black and Tans, if you've ever heard of them, The Royal Irish Constabulary, which was the local policing force from the English, most of them were Catholic, and they were resigning right and left. And so in order to have some sort of force there, the English hired mercenaries. They hired thugs, brought them over, many of them with criminal records, and they didn't even have a uniform for them. So they gave them the khaki pants of the military and the dark jackets of the Royal Irish Constabulary, and so they were called the Black and Tans. And they were brutal. They were thugs. They beat people up. They murdered folks. It was terrible. Well, finally they come to an agreement, but unfortunately, most of the people in Ireland did not like the agreement because they did not want to swear fealty to the Queen. They did not want to have to separate Northern Ireland. So they were unhappy with it, and they have, for 11 months, the Irish Civil War. Michael Collins, for all of his efforts, was actually assassinated by his own side during this. It was a fight between the Republican side, which meant those who wanted to be a completely independent republic, and the nationalist side, who said, if we're a free state, we'll get the rest later. So they fought for 11 months, and England funded the free state side. In other words, they gave them weapons and money. It got so bad for the Republican side, they ended up robbing banks in order to get enough money to try to support their side. After 11 months, the free state side won. The Civil War ended. But unfortunately, in 1924, the English said to the new Free State of Ireland, you owe us 50 million pounds that we gave you to fight this war. And they said, we don't have 50 million pounds. We're pretty much bankrupt because of the war and everything anyway. And they said, well, you owe us the money. I tell you what, we will forgive your debt to England if you will accept Northern Ireland as a separate territory. Still part of Great Britain, and they really didn't have a choice. That led us to the 30 years of war in the North. Again, Catholic and Protestant. By the 1960s, and this happened from 69 to 99, the Catholics in Northern Ireland, which was a Protestant majority, in the 1930s, Eamon de Valera becomes president of the Free State. They move to the point where they become a free republic. They get all the things they want except Northern Ireland. They still haven't been able to make that part of the Republic of Ireland. And so they end up with two sides, the Unionist or Loyalist side that's Protestant, the Republican or Nationalist side that's Catholic. They have their own paramilitary forces that are doing battle. The government of England, of Britain, is trying to stay out of it. They're trying to stay neutral. But the only thing they insist is it will not become part of the Republic of Ireland unless the majority of people vote yes. Well, at this time, in the late 60s up through the 90s, Catholics still, because most of them were much poorer and did not own property, they were not allowed to vote. Because you had to be a property owner to vote. There were positions they could not fill. They could not be in government. They could not be a policeman. There were all sorts of other limitations in terms of employment and that sort of thing. So much of the same kind of oppression that had happened much longer in Ireland was still going on. And so we have this 30-year war in which about 5,000 people are killed, almost 5,000 people are killed, 50,000 are wounded. It's primarily a guerrilla war. The thing that astonishes me about these pictures, and they're very common, is here you've got a soldier running down the street with his weapon, and you've got a boy who looks like he's maybe 12 years old, also running down the street with his weapon. You've got young women arm in arm, apparently having a good day, walking up to a corner where there are soldiers apparently fighting a battle around the corner. You've got buses that have apparently just been blown up. There were a lot of bombs. And kids out in the street playing, with the thing still burning. Young men coming and sort of yelling at soldiers with weapons. These kids grew up with this for 30 years. And it went back and forth until finally nobody wanted this anymore. And in 1999, the paramilitary units, and there were a number of them, agreed they would give up their weapons, they would sign a truce, and that a couple of times England had to withdraw the governance of in Northern Ireland from self-determination because it was out of control. They finally agreed that they would move toward greater equity, greater freedom, which they did. It's still, the Catholics are still the poorest. They still have certain things, they don't have the same level of freedom as the Protestants because everybody's afraid somebody else is going to get control. It's really not an argument about religion, it's about political control and about the extent of freedom that is allowed. But they did come to a peace, the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement. They came to peace in 1999. They've had some trouble since, but not like they did. And Carol and I talked to an Irish cabbie, and I said, what do you think about the situation in Northern Ireland? He said, it's fine, but it could blow up. The wrong incident happens, the wrong person gets killed or whatever, it could all blow up again. So there's still that danger. Any questions about that? History of Ireland. I have gone on for an hour. I warned you. So sorry about that. Any questions about any of this? No, there they sat stunned for some moments. Yes. Yeah, in the 1930s, it sort of was a process. Eamon de Valera became the president of the Free State of Ireland in 1932. I think it was 34. And they took him a couple of years after that, but it was in the mid-30s. Other questions?
What about the root of the Gaelic language? What does that actually come from?
What is the root of the Gaelic language? Well, the Celts, this was the language of the Celts. And so as they got pushed over there, it's actually rooted, it's a Germanic language. It's from the same roots as the Norse language. And of course, it was influenced some by the Vikings as they came along. We'll talk about language things later. But the Gaelic in Ireland, Gaelic in Scotland, the Manx language, Welsh, the Cornish language are all closely related, and they're all sort of German Norse. And Norse is a Germanic language. I mean, it's old German. All of those have the same root, and that's because the Celts came from that area in Central Western Europe primarily. Okay, but then as over the several thousand years, each area has developed differences. As they say, it's sort of like Spanish and Portuguese. I had a friend once who grew up in Brazil, and I asked him if he could speak Spanish because he spoke Portuguese fluently, and he said, "No, I can't speak Spanish. I can read Spanish because it looks the same." But for instance, in Spanish, "Cómo está?" We live in Mexico. "Cómo está?" means "How are you?" In Portuguese, it's spelled exactly the same way, and it means the same thing, but it's pronounced "Como está?" And that's very much the case with Gaelic, for instance. They're related languages, and often people can understand each other some, but they are distinct.